Hello, I'm V.B. Price. I'm the editor of New Mexico Mercury. I'm here today with historian, author, and teacher, and really old pal of mine, Chris Wilson, who is the J.B. Jackson Professor of Cultural Landscape Studies in the University of New Mexico's School of Architecture and Planning. He's the author and editor of two of my favorite books, The Myth of Santa Fe, Creating a Modern Regional Tradition, and The Plazas of New Mexico, edited with Stefanos Palazoides, with the photographs of Miguel Gandert. The context of our conversation is the urgent new environmental conditions that require cities to respond by rethinking their economies and their visions of themselves, including rebranding their image and retrofitting their infrastructure. Retrofitting, if you will, both their image and their self-image. It's really wonderful to have you here with us, Chris.
Well, Barrett, it's great to be here. And let me just say how much I love what you're doing with New Mexico Mercury, and it's an honor to join you.
Thank you so much. You know, in your wonderful book, The Myth of Santa Fe, which I've read many times now, you explain not only how a particular place can create itself in its own chosen image and likeness, but that such a thing is possible at all. One doesn't think a city can choose to be something, that it just is. It seems like Santa Fe to me is a kind of an object lesson for the future. Could you explain what happened up there and how it came to be?
We talk about individuals having identity crises, but cities can have identity crises too. Santa Fe, of course, was a mythical destination at the end of the Santa Fe Trail. Major railroad, Santa Fe Railroad, named after it, loomed large in the American imagination. But when the railroad was built through New Mexico, the engineers found that the terrain was so high and steep going into Santa Fe that they couldn't bring their main line there. And so they bypassed the city, and Las Vegas, New Mexico, and Albuquerque quickly overtook Santa Fe in population, economic vitality. Santa Fe was in serious economic decline, lost 10% of its population each decade from 1880 to 1910, wow, and dropped from 7,000 people to just a little over 5,000 people. But in that time, as the state capital, its leaders had to carry the campaign for statehood. And the way they did that, there were suspicions in the East, especially about the Hispanic Catholic population. Were they trustworthy? Were they loyal citizens?
Oh, God. Yeah.
And of course, the fact that the majority of the Rough Rider volunteers in Teddy Roosevelt's unit during the Spanish-American War came from New Mexico, laid those kind of suspicions to rest. But right, these leaders had to make this claim that the territory was Americanized and loyal. And they did that with Richardsonian Romanesque school buildings, right, and neoclassical state capitol, and they basically did everything they could to turn Santa Fe into any town USA as part of their campaign. And they showed photos of the city in their promotional brochures and the reports they sent to Congress. All the while, the city's declining. So when statehood's finally granted in 1912, then Mayor Celso Lopez in Santa Fe says, and the business community, we have to do something to stem this decline. There's a kind of a welling up of pride in having achieved statehood, but a knowledge that the community's in decline, and it had keyed its identity towards this statehood campaign, towards Americanization, toward the dream that wasn't realized of becoming a major metropolis with the coming of the railroad. And so Lopez appointed a city planning commission, and they went to work corresponding with planning leaders around the country. The City Beautiful movement at that time was in the lead. And that was a movement which tried to bring refinement and coherence to Eastern cities by adopting usually neoclassicism as a way of creating a civic precinct that, in the face of the kind of turbulence of skyscrapers going up in these vibrant cities, had lost a sense of coherence. And so City Beautiful movement tried to bring that to civic precincts and so forth. And so Santa Fe said, well, that's all well and good, but the possibility of turning our economy around are these tourists that have started to filter through the town. Right. They're drawn by the mythic name of Santa Fe. They're drawn by the Indian pueblos in the region, by the desert landscapes. But they take one look at our Central Plaza, which is surrounded by business blocks that look like any place, and they just keep going. And so they say tourism is going to be our salvation, and in order to reverse the ill-conceived Americanization, we're going to have to define and use, and they call it at first the Santa Fe style. Right. You might call it the Spanish Pueblo Revival. It draws on both of those great historic architectural traditions, but they very systematically set about remaking the heart of the city in a more historic image. They remodeled the business blocks to look like, adobe buildings. They build new buildings such as La Fonda, the Museum of New Mexico, and this is where, if you face not only an economic crisis, but in that case, a crisis of identity. They had wanted to be this American city, and then they realized tourism is their salvation, and so they have to change their identity. They have to change their self-identity, and so it helps to have a cultural institution. And Santa Fe was one of the few in the American West to have a major cultural institution, the Museum of New Mexico, right. Founded in 1909. And so it had people that were used to thinking about culture, used to working with images, painters and photographers and so forth. And so the museum very quickly joined in an alliance with the Santa Fe Railroad advertising department. And they started to take photographs of the historic remnants around town, of the pueblos, of the landscapes. As they got these revival-style buildings in place, the Fine Arts Museum 1916, La Fonda 1921, they would immediately funnel photographs to the advertising department and to magazines around the country. And so very quickly, really in a matter of a decade or 15 years at most, they created a new visual identity, they attracted an art colony, and they really recast the identity of the city in the national imagination, and everybody in the community let go of the Americanization campaign and embrace this new identity. And to this day, that's what really drives Santa Fe's economy and its arts and its creative heart.
So Albuquerque, of course, took a completely different turn. It wanted to compete with what would be Phoenix and Denver and Los Angeles and Amarillo and Salt Lake City, and it suffered a crisis of identity too in its own way, because it could never quite shake the strange sort of the shadow of being in the states in a state that was considered by most people the most foreign in the Union. But that was also its greatest asset in many ways. But now today, you have a city like ours, which has tried to compete with these other big cities. Has done quite well for being the largest city and the poorest state in the Union. But now it's in the middle of a serious water crisis, as are all major cities in the West. It's in the middle of still a long, lingering recession with nothing new coming along to really apparently rescue its economy. And it seems like, in a way, we are also facing, because of these environmental conditions, a crisis of identity. We have to do something new, it seems, to become a place that people and businesses want to inhabit. So I'm wondering what role, how do we do this? The other big issue, too, is that we're no longer competing with just regional cities in the Western United States. So we're competing with global cities all over the world. We have a brain culture here. Nobody seems to think that, but we do. We have huge national laboratories. We have a national university. We have a huge community of writers and artists and all kinds of thinkers. How do we do a kind of a Santa Feization of ourselves? Can we do that here, do you think?
Wow.
Sorry.
No, no. Rich issues and ones that you've addressed in your columns and your books over the years. And I guess I'd like to build a little bit of a context about the role that self-identity and kind of a branding or image in the larger world and the role that they play in this.
Yeah.
Now, Santa Fe was really interesting, but because it was one of the first cities that actually branded itself with an image. Cities didn't do that before, and it was this synergy of tourism and of marketing of the railroad that caused it to develop a kind of brandable image. A city like Albuquerque in that era, its economic position was based on being a transportation crossroads, and the fact that once that was taken for granted, that's where the regional economic engine was going to be. That's where educational institutions and federal government offices and services and hospitals, and so it becomes a regional service center, and it doesn't rely on having an image to project to the world in the same way that Santa Fe does.
So true.
Now, in addition to the environmental issues that you cite, and maybe I'll come back to those, I would add the new conditions of globalization that have developed over the last generation. That's a term that emerged in international finance in the 1970s. And it was, the first ideas were we're going to lower trade barriers, we're going to lower currency controls, we're going to let goods and people and capital and investment flow much more freely. Hand in hand with that was often reducing labor and environmental controls, diminishing the power of national governments in favor of growing international corporations. And, in the United States, Ronald Reagan, in England, Margaret Thatcher, in terms of downsizing government and being in favor of deregulation. They're kind of the first major political figures that are carrying that globalization campaign forward. It goes hand in hand. When I say decline in the power of national governments, we have nations that break up in those years. The Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Spain is still a nation, but today it has autonomous regions that Catalonia, Andalusia, that control their resources and have a degree of autonomy within the nation. That kind of decentralization and move to the regions isn't as apparent for most people in the United States. We have a very strong sense of, well, these are our borders and we're all in the United States. But once locations had to start competing for investment with international corporations, it was not national economic policy so much as local alliances of political and business leaders who would form together and say, we're going to go after X plant, the Saturn plant. We want that, and this whole process of giving free land, tax breaks, pay for the training of a workforce, all of these inducements. And so it becomes really a cutthroat competition, not only for say Intel microchip plants, but any economic sector. And New Mexico has in fact had such a policy, and lots of people participated in it. But we should think of Bill Richardson's administration, his 8 years. And the major initiatives of that. Well, the Rail Runner is one, and looking to transit policy, land use policy, sustainability, is one part of it. But there were essentially three economic sectors that Richardson and his allies tried to attract to New Mexico, and one of them got pretty good traction. Two of them didn't quite get traction. One was the production of solar panels, and it was starting to gear up some production facilities here, and in particular the Chinese government emphasis of that and really driving down the cost of production and flooding the market, cut the legs, from under that initiative. A second was Eclipse Aviation and the development of a small jet, kind of private jet, which was expensive in production to get it to, and they got it to production just when the Great Recession hit. And so the kind of orders that they needed to recoup the huge investments and really keep it going were not forthcoming. And so that's closed up shop. The third sector was film and television production and the use of incentives by the state, tax breaks and loans that were forgiven, in terms of if there was sufficient employment and so forth. And that, as we know, did get some traction. We'll have to see how long-lived it is, because other cities and regions have entered that competition and are making tax credits available, and so there's more competition for that. Those kind of film and TV productions. There's to me, an ironic and really troubling side effect of having attracted this sector, this film and TV sector. It's positive in terms of employment. It's positive in terms of being a creative sector, which spins off not just jobs, but it spins off a creative ability to generate an attractive lifestyle and to start to control the image and the self-image. But when we think about the television shows
Oh my gosh.
that have characterized Albuquerque, predating the attempt to develop film and television production here, the fact that Albuquerque had more episodes of the TV show Cops shot in its town than any other city in the United States.
Wow.
Something that started to generate this image of a crime-ridden Sunbelt city. And as I remember, it was Marty Chavez was the mayor at that point, and the police had been cooperating in doing this. And he said, "Hey, wait a minute, this is giving us a terrible identity." Now, I think the impact, way an identity like that can get going, then when there are these inducements to bring television and film production here, and the script writers and the program idea developers and pilot writers in Los Angeles, that's the identity they have, and so they give us Breaking Bad and In Plain Sight. And so, traveling in Europe over the years, until very recently, you'd say, "I'm from Albuquerque," and kind of get a blank look. And then you say, "Well, that's near Santa Fe." "Oh, Santa Fe, we know Santa Fe." Now, people know Albuquerque, taxi cab drivers, other people, and you say, "I'm from Albuquerque," and they say, "Breaking Bad."
Yeah.
And so I think it's really, as I've said, ironic and a little troubling that we spent several $100 million developing this sector of our economy, and one side effect was to brand the city as a gang-ridden, meth lab cooking desert city.
Disaster, actually.
Yeah, really a disaster. And as you asked me to talk, to think about these questions, and the more I thought about it, it may take us a generation to overcome this image. We're finally fixed in the international imagination, and in a negative way.
Oh my God. This is a tremendously troubling thing, and I'm sure an outside image can reinforce a negative internal self-image. I'm wondering if our problems with local police have much to do with that sudden and certainly inadvertent negative rebranding. I'm not sure. What I started thinking about is how did Santa Fe maintain a political cohesion long enough to do all that it did to remake itself? I'm thinking here we have a film industry, and the next administration, Martinez administration, decides to step away at it and cut back at it and do whatever it tried to do, which is hard to fathom, actually. But How did Santa Fe hold itself together politically to pull off a major rebranding like that?
Well, I think Santa Fe was able to sustain this program because it did take decades. I just said it took 10 to 15 years
Yeah.
to remake its image nationally, but to really develop tourism and, Santa Fe as an art center and so forth took decades, and it was an ongoing challenge. I think the fact that there was an alliance among politicians in the city, artists in the art colony, the professional cultural workers at the museum in New Mexico, each for their own reasons. I mean, the politicians, the business community, it's pure economics. The city has limited economic options. It's got state government, and it's losing population, and it seizes on what's often called in the editorials the goose that lays the golden egg. People will say, well, they've asked us to host a Japanese internment camp during the Second World War, and this is the day after this is announced, and they say that's fine, we'll do our part in the war effort, but when the war's done, we have to erase all traces of this internment camp because that could kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And so
Wow.
the newspaper writers, the politicians, the business people are all aware of this. The artists, the cultural workers are, in support because the tourism is about history, culture, place, distinctiveness,
Right.
all things that they love. And so there's just a very strong coalition and alliance. It starts to fray in the 1980s. And what happens essentially is that one of the other aspects of globalization is an increase in tourism, in jet travel, exponential increase in those years. For all that we think of globalization as being technology and finance driving towards homogenization of culture, as I said, there's a breakup of countries into regions, and regional difference becomes a marketable commodity within the world of jet travel and increased tourism. And so places like Santa Fe, and there are only a handful that have a well-developed ensemble, and it could be music, food, furniture design, architecture, arts. Places that are already tourism destinations immediately can capitalize on the intensification of tourism under globalization. And so the vogue of Santa Fe and a book like Santa Fe Style, which becomes the model for other regional design books. Santa Fe's primed and ready and capitalizes on globalization, begins to attract a new type of resident from those years, which I call amenity migrants. So
That's wonderful.
yeah. So these are people who have disposable income, and we've got to remember that that one of the things that Ronald Reagan starts and carries forward to the present is the reduction of upper tax brackets.
Right.
And so the well-to-do, I mean, what we've been calling in the last year or two the 1%, have even more money than they had before, begin to buy second homes, third homes, pied-à-terres in cities, and a house in Santa Fe. And so it's not just the million-plus tourists a year that come, but it's also several thousand amenity migrants who come and buy houses and stay, and the real estate value and the real estate market starts to escalate to the point that a lot of the longtime residents, a lot of the working class residents, can't afford to live there anymore. In a sense, the whole town starts to gentrify in the 80s. People move to Espanola, they move to Albuquerque, they commute to their tourism service jobs, to their government jobs. And that's really the point at which the coalition that forms in the teens starts to fray a little bit. And then in those years, Mayor Debbie Jaramillo, raises the issue of the now negative side effects of the tourism boom. She says, What we did is we painted the downtown brown and we moved the brown people out.
So, trying to think about Albuquerque in relation to this, we have never been a unified place like that. We've never had a major sort of coming together of the minds to do something straightforward. We have antagonism between the business community, between the intellectual community at the university. The bases are almost invisible, although they supply huge amounts of employment. The tremendous, as I like to call it, blue-collar artists and writers community here, and everybody working like mad, doing wonderful work is also invisible. Nobody talks to one another. There's, there's this place with vast amounts of potential, with also a huge cultural treasure house and its museums and its library and its university. They can't seem to really think about how to do anything with itself. It's sort of floundering in my judgment. And as these environmental problems become more intense and as we get harder up for water and as we probably are going to have to shrink ourselves in size, we're not going to be able to compete with places like Denver that can still tap into the Colorado River, particularly Denver or Salt Lake City or even Amarillo. So we're going to be sort of stuck, I think. The housing industry isn't going to come back anytime soon, in my judgment. We really can't afford really any more Intel. There's just not enough water to do that. There never has been. So what kind of a new image and a new self-image do we have to create in order to survive as a regional center in a increasingly pressured and almost starving state? I think in one sense, I know we started to talk about this a little while ago, the whole notion of the creative class. I'm wondering if it's possible to talk among ourselves in such a way as to see that creative class already exists in Albuquerque to a large degree. It's never been galvanized. And maybe that's the direction we need to go.
Well, it's exhilarating and a bit daunting talking with you, Barrett, because you've thought so deeply about these things and you've written profoundly about them. You mentioned the creative class, and just a quick synopsis of that idea. It comes from the book of about 10 years ago by Richard Florida, The Rise of the Creative Class, and he makes the argument that traditionally cities, a certain type of city succeeded by having a specialization. Pittsburgh was steel production, Detroit was automobile production, New York City was publishing and media and the arts, and they developed thick labor markets. Lots of employers in these sectors, creative people, engineers, writers, editors, were attracted to particular cities because of that. So that under globalization, it's not just a competition for investment, corporate investment to develop certain kinds of factories or economic sectors, but that it's the regions that can attract creative people, especially young creative people that are, say, coming out of school, are mobile. They're at the point in their life where they can choose to move someplace. And he cites some of these are traditional places, Hollywood, Los Angeles, New York City, but Austin, Portland, Seattle, over the last generation, have really emerged as creative cultural centers, and as a result, economic powerhouses. He argues because they've been able to attract these young creative people. He identifies a number of factors that go into that. Cultural and lifestyle diversity and an apparent tolerance and respect for different ethnic groups, different lifestyles. He says the presence of a visible gay subculture and community is often a marker for young people looking for where they're going. That says to them, this is a this is a tolerant place. I mean, there's been such a transformation in our attitudes about gay rights in the last days, weeks, months, few years that maybe that's become much more general. But at one point, that was a marker. The presence of a lot of other creative people and opportunities to express the arts and creativity. And then a high quality life and cultural amenities. For some, access to nature, to natural recreational life, but in particular, an amenity of a rich, you could call it a nightlife or a street life. A more urban life that people could look to, a music scene, sidewalk cafes, coffee houses when those were, kind of starting to come back 15 or 20 years ago. And so to be viable, region increases its chances if it can attract this kind of a group and this kind of a subculture. Albuquerque has the cultural and ethnic diversity. I think it has the tolerance.
I do too.
It has the natural amenities. It has, because of the Native American and Hispanic cultural content and the deep history, it has the image of cultural amenity. Yeah. It hasn't had, but has started to develop that street life, that urban life, urban nightlife. And I think that it really has a spatial axis that you can really find and you can really point to. And I think of it as the area from Old Town to the downtown residential neighborhoods, to downtown, to the Huning Highlands neighborhood that's recently been rebranded Edo, right, to the university, to Nob Hill. Right. And there are other neighborhoods a little bit clustered around that. But in the 6 or 8 years before the Great Recession hit, there was a lot of construction within about 2 blocks north or south of that axis, from Nob Hill, through the university to downtown and Old Town, by architect developer teams. And it was the first time that there had been new construction in these neighborhoods in 2 generations, say. And these were mixed-use buildings, often commercial on the ground floor, condos or apartments above. You can think of the node around the Century 14 Theater, the node around the Flying Star Coffee House downtown, the node around the lofts at Albuquerque High, individual buildings in the Nob Hill area. The development of the Rapid Ride, the bus rapid transit line along Central, just kind of approaching critical mass when the recession hit.
Right.
But I think that one of the things that that's been shown nationally is that the neighborhoods that held the value of their real estate through the, let's hope, the trough of the recession, let's hope we're coming out of it, but the neighborhoods that held value, some increased modestly or didn't lose, unlike suburban neighborhoods, were these inner city neighborhoods, especially with access to mass transit. And I think those reflect a kind of watershed generational shift that's taking place. That there's a younger generation, Generation X, Generation Y. I lose track of the names, but the kids that are from teenage into mid-30s now, who in much higher proportions want an urban lifestyle, want urban amenities, are willing to live in a smaller residential space, to give up and lose the negative of a long commute by automobile, and somewhat more urban places than we are. There are bike share programs, there are car share programs. Young people use mass transit, and they occasionally rent a car, or they need a pickup truck. There are these systems for them to snag one for a day. I think we've laid the beginning, I don't know, foundation, skeleton, whatever you want to call it, along that axis that I described. And you're already seeing, cultural developments of various kinds that are not only there, but they're focusing in this area. You could say the rise of local agriculture, of grower markets, of farm to table restaurants, of a kind of a foodie scene in the city.
Which is excellent.
You think of the downtown farmers market. That's kind of a manifestation of that. The kind of development of much more than I about how media have changed, but newspapers in decline, and digital media, blogs, and digital journals such as the New Mexico Mercury starting to take the place of that. Another website that I really find fascinating is Residents of Burke. Profiling.
Yeah, it's
you know
great. It's a great
all
one.
kinds of Albuquerque
Yeah, he's a great
residents, and I think there's in the same sense that there's a kind of physical spine that's starting to take place. There's a quickening of an online identity and community and discourse in Albuquerque. And I've lived here, over 30 years, and this is the most cultural intellectual ferment that I can remember in the city around these new largely digital media initiatives.
I think you're exactly right. I think there is a new urban world developing in Albuquerque now. I don't think Albuquerque leadership really understands it particularly. I think a certain portion of the business community does, but not the big sort of old-fashioned aspect of it. But in order to really remake ourselves to fit the times and to make the most out of the challenges that we have to live with and that we have to adapt to, it seems to me that we need to bring all of the insights we can, all of the rationality that we can, and particularly all of the awareness of cultural landscape that we can to our predicament. If you look at the one city in our state that has long, long ago remade itself to fit the circumstances that it had to face, and you suddenly associate it with what some people call faux adobe, and you then sort of discard it. You also discard, I think, as you've written about, the much more important aspect of things. How does one develop and advance and use in a practical way regional design strategies that have succeeded here for millennia if you deny or sort of toss away the success story of a place like that?
Well, Barrett, I like the way that has really been a conversation about two cities, and we've given maybe roughly equal weight and gone back and forth between the two. If we remember that Santa Fe had an identity crisis around the turn of the century, when it was Americanizing itself as part of the campaign for statehood, but then realized that tourism and its historic identity was going to be its salvation. It reconciled its identity by letting go of one side of it, the Americanization, and embracing the other for tourism reasons. Yeah. I think Albuquerque has a split identity as well. It in the 30s, say, there was a height of regional identity that was very much like Santa Fe. And yes. the place that you see it most clearly is the University of New Mexico campus, and so it was part of a larger sense of regional historical cultural identity, and shared that with Santa Fe. The big change then was the development of Kirtland Air Base, of the Sandia Lab, and of a scientific engineering side to the city. That happened in the 40s and then into the 1950s at a time when modernism in architecture was at the fore. And so there's a radical change from those buildings at UNM to a number of steel and glass skyscrapers in the downtown, to houses which are, and automobile dealerships and so forth that are international style buildings. I think since then we've had this uneasy, unresolved inclination on the part of some people to want to embrace the regional, on the part of others to say, oh no, that's faux adobe, that's false, that's Santa Fe, we don't want to be that. We're a modern city, we're a scientific city, we're an engineering city.
Right.
And that kind of issue operates in a particular way at the University of New Mexico, where since the 1930s, there's been rhetorical commitment. You might say lip service if you want to give it a pejorative, but there's been this rhetorical commitment to regionalism and grounding the university in regionalism, at the same time that not only the science departments and the engineering departments in the university pull it towards the contemporary and the technological, but the fact that the majority of the tenure track professors who really lead the university are educated elsewhere. They come here with a commitment to a kind of universal meritocracy and set of values, and they often, I think, don't deepen their understanding of where they are. And they tend, and I'm in the School of Architecture and Planning. Many of my colleagues dismiss regionalism as faux adobe. And I say to them, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot more going on in the regional tradition than, some people building with contemporary materials and dressing it up to look like adobe. And so I think, to try to make sense out of these meanderings, I think about architecture, which is one way to resolve this identity crisis, and because it's so visible, as we've seen in Santa Fe, and its branding of itself, I think that a real embrace of the traditions of regional design here, which are sustainable, and that's the thing about a lot of regional vernacular traditions. As they were practiced before the Industrial Revolution, in this case, before the railroad came, before there was abundant fossil fuel, and you could put in a furnace and heat your house, and then later an air conditioner and climate control the building, then you didn't have to pay attention to the time-honored ways of designing buildings to be energy efficient, to work with the climate. And so, when people say faux adobe, I say, well, but what about the sustainability techniques of passive solar orientation in buildings? There are these deep lessons grounded in the region, that can be a starting point for sustainability, and and they ground us in our history. Another one is the reurbanization that's going on around the country, and I mentioned the Nob Hill to Old Town axis would be our local example of that, just starting to get traction. But that's really a rediscovery of traditional urbanism as it was practiced before the automobile.
Yes.
And you've raised, and I haven't really addressed to this point, this challenge of diminished water. Are we going to have to contract population? We have to get much more sustainable and use many fewer resources. And when you realize that the lowest per capita energy use in the country are the residents of Manhattan because of traditional urbanism. Yes. Buildings with shared ceilings, roofs, party walls, dense enough areas that you can have mass transit, which is much more efficient in use of energy than automobiles. And so, I think to embrace these climactically and urbanistically situated regional traditions, not say it doesn't have to look like Santa Fe, it doesn't have to look like faux adobe. It can, in fact, be constructed of contemporary materials. Given the popular sensibility, maybe it embraces an earthen palette as a nod towards the regional tradition. I think Antoine Predoc's George Pearl Hall, where the School of Architecture and the Fine Arts and Design Library are, are a good indication of a building that's thoroughly contemporary and that echoes the regional tradition in a very positive way. And so I would look for everybody involved in this to be aware of our split identity, to be committed to being contemporary, artistically, aesthetically, intellectually, to not turn away from our problems, but to apply our best imagination, and to realize that we have profound cultural traditions that we can cultivate, that we can ground ourselves in, that we can make thoroughly contemporary, and project that to the world. A kind of a new urban vibrance grounded in where we are.
That is a beautiful vision, and one that I deeply share with you. Seems like we've sort of set ourselves up for another interview, a long interview down the road that deals with regional design strategies and how to make the most of who we really are in the world that we really live in. So I'm looking very forward to doing that with you. Not all that long away, I hope, but lots to talk about. And this has been incredibly enlightening for me. I mean, you've helped me to sort of put things in context again, as you always do. I mean, this is your great gift to me, is this wonderful capacity to put things where they belong. I really enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Barrett. And you're so stimulating to talk with. I feel like you've squeezed out every idea I had. And so, I'll recuperate and, see if I can come back.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.